In this video, we're going to look at a type of function called logarithmic function, and more generally, we'll have a kind of introduction to logarithms here. And one way of thinking about logarithms is that they're just an inverse of exponential functions. So if you had an exponential function, for example, y equals 10 to the power of x, we can define something called log base 10 of x, this thing here, which is the inverse function of this. So if the x values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 give you 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, what we can do is we can swap the x and the y around to get this new table over here. And the x values would be 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and the y values would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if we'd graphed these values, 10 to the power of x, we would get this graph over here, y equals 10 to the power of x. If you graphed these points, right, 1, 0, 10, 1, 100, 2, we would get this graph over here. This would be the inverse of this, because it's reflected in y equals x. So this graph here is the graph of y equals log base 10 of x. Just think of it as being the inverse of 10 to the power of x. Now look at these values here again. If someone gave you an x value of 1,000 and said, okay, what's the y value going to be? The question you could ask would be, well, 10 to the power of what gives me 1,000? And if someone says, how do you go from this number to get this number? You'd say, okay, well, 10 to the power of what gives me this? 10 to the power of 4. So what you've got to ask yourself is, whenever you're doing logarithms, is ask yourself, okay, if you've got this kind of thing here, you've got to say, okay, 10 to the power of what gives me this whole thing here? 10 to the power of 5 is going to give me this. And if you've got this kind of thing here, 10 log base 10 of what a tenth is, now remember that 1/10 is equal to 10 to the power of minus 1. So think about this, 10 to the power of what would give me 1/10? It would have to be 10 to the power of minus 1. Now, log base 10 is kind of a special base. It's called the common logarithm. Common logarithm is this thing here. So when we use base 10, we tend not to write the 10 down here. We often just leave the 10 out. And in fact, on your calculator, there's a log button. That log button represents log base 10. Right? So whenever you see just log of x, it means log base 10 of x. So basic idea, if you've got log base 10 of something, think to yourself, 10 to the power of what gives me this value? Right? 10 to the power of what gives me this? And here the answer is 6. So if we extend that to these kinds of values here, if we try to think, well, 10 to the power of what gives me 1? Well, 10 to the power of 0 gives me 1. If you think to yourself, 10 to the power of what gives me 10? 10 to the power of 1 gives me 10. In this example, 10 to the power of what gives me 10 to the power of y? Well, 10 to the power of y gives me 10 to the power of y. And if you have 10 to the power of log x, well, the 10 and the log base 10 kind of act as inverses of each other, so you end up with x in a case like that. Now, 10 isn't the only base that you can use. You could use any base, or at least any base that's positive, and also not equal to 1. If you take any sort of exponential function, b to the power of x, then its inverse would be called log base b of x. So one example of that would be this one here. If someone asked you to say what's log base 5 of 25, you would have to say, okay, 5 to the power of what gives me 25? 5 to the power of 2. If someone said log base 2 of 8, what is that? You'd have to say, okay, 2 to the power of what gives me 8? 2 to the power of 3. Now, anytime you've got an exponential form of an equation, and we have 3 examples here of exponential form, they can equally well be written in exponential form. This example here would be log base b of a, so it's log base b of a is equal to n. This one would be log base 5 of 125 is equal to 3. Log base, in this one, log base 2 of a 16th is equal to minus 4. So if someone asked you what log base 10 of 100,000 was, think to yourself, 10 to the power of what gives me 100,000? I want to allow you to try these 5 questions just now. So pause the video and then play again once you've tried to answer these 5 questions. Okay, for the first one, 10 to the power of what gives me 100,000? It would have to be 10 to the power of 5. So the answer there is 5. In the second one, here, think to yourself, 2 to the power of what gives me 16? Well, 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 again, 2 cubed is 8, 2 to the power of 4 is 16. So we should have in here log base 2 of 16 is equal to 4. And then the next example, 3 to the power of what is 27? You should have 3 to the power of 3. So log base 3 of 27 is 3. In that next example, where the log base 5 of 1 over 125, 1 over 125 is the same as 5 to the power of negative 3. So in this example, we're going to have minus 3 there. And in E, the square root of 7 is the same as 7 to the power of half. So what do we have to raise 7 to get the square root of 7? It's going to be a half.